Thank you very much, and very good to have had this opening session already with so many voices from around the world, and you picked up on it as well. I think that's the richness of this conference, this opportunity to link up people from around the world. So now I will be very pleased to give the floor to the eminent Leonardo Garnier, who was the special advisor to the United Nations Summit on Transforming Education. Leonardo Garnier is from Costa Rica, and he has worked under the leadership of Amina Mohamed, the Deputy Secretary General and Chair of the United Nations Sustainable Development Group, to organize the work and orchestrate the work during the Transforming Education Summit. It's a great honor to meet you online and hopefully in the future also face to face. As you know, the education systems in the world are at a crossroads. Many global, regional, and national initiatives have been developed to foster a lot of attention to the very importance of education and the imperative to develop quality education systems and institutions to respond to the local and global challenges we face. And that's what several global events have been working on and allowed the global higher education community to work on. There was the World Conference on Education for Sustainable Development in Berlin online in 2021. There was the World Higher Education Conference in Barcelona. There was the Futures of Education Initiative, which led to the development of a report that forms the backdrop to many of the discussions, and in particular as well, a backdrop to the discussions that took place at the TESS, first at the pre-summit in Paris and later at the summit in New York. And so you have been able to look at how the discussions did unfold in both fora, both in Paris and in New York, and how the task actually allowed to recommit governments around the world to education as a public common good. And I hope you will be able to confirm that and to tell us more about it. And this test also served to mobilize action, to really mobilize ambition, to mobilize solidarity in order to recover not only from the pandemic losses, but actually also to address the pre-existing challenges. Do you come from a background of economics, and you have been for a long time a lecturer at the University of Costa Rica, and also a researcher at the Institute of Economic Science and Research. And I believe that that background as well is a very important one for the conversations that you've been able to lead on, leading up to the tests. So I hope you will be able to tell us more about the 5 action tracks that were the tracks that the different stakeholders were invited to work on during the tests. And we very much look forward to hearing from you about the outcomes of that very important moment in the history of the development and transformation of education. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for inviting me. I'm having some technical difficulties because electricity went down just like 15 minutes ago, so I'm connecting from my phone and it breaks down. So if it breaks down, I will connect again. So I apologize. Going into the education and what we discussed at the summit, the first thing is to recognize that the COVID pandemic hit a terrible blow to education systems all around the world. However, as we strive to recover from its educational impact, it would be a mistake if we simply aimed at recovering those losses and going back to where we were in 2019. The truth is that even before the pandemic, education in the world was facing what we could call a triple crisis: a crisis of equity, as millions of children and youth were out of school; a crisis of quality, as many of those who were in school were not even learning the basics; and of course, a crisis of relevance, as our educational systems were not equipping the new generations with the values, the knowledge, the skills they need to be active, productive, and constructive citizens in today's complex and rapidly changing world. So in order to confront such crisis, we must aim high. We must reimagine and transform education so that it empowers individuals and societies, both to reshape the present and to lead us to a more dynamic, just, sustainable, resilient, and peaceful future. So in the summit, following very much the 1996 Delors report, uh, the Secretary General's vision statement from the Transforming Education Summit reminded us that education must support learners in four key capacities. Uh, First, they must learn to learn. All learners should develop their ability to read and write, to identify, understand, and communicate clearly and effectively. They must also develop mathematics, scientific, and digital knowledge and skills. Education must also instill in them the curiosity, the creativity, the capacity for critical thinking, and to nurture social and emotional skills, empathy, kindness. This is essential for developing their capacity to deal with complexity in an increasingly uncertain world. Second, they must learn to do. As the world of work undergoes rapid and fundamental changes, so must education change. In order to prepare every person for the challenges of the future, including the green, the digital, the care economy, and offering them lifelong learning opportunities, both in formal education and informal education. Third, and this is a bigger challenge for educational systems around the world, they must learn to live together. In a world of increasing inequality, rising tensions, fraying trust, weakened democratic culture, dramatic environmental crisis, education must help us to live better with each other and better with nature. This has to do with ethics, equality, and justice, with civic responsibility, democracy, human rights, with the respect, understanding, and enjoyment of rich human diversity, and of course, with our capacity and active commitment as national and as global citizens, with the goals of confronting poverty and inequality and promoting a more sustainable development. And finally, and this is something educational systems very often forget or underestimate, they must learn to be. The deepest purpose of education lies precisely in learning how to live well, instilling in learners the values and capacities to lead a meaningful life, to enjoy that life, to live it fully. Education must expand every learner's potential for creativity, for innovation, their capacity to enjoy and to express themselves through the arts, their awareness of history, the diversity of cultures, and their disposition for leading a healthy life, to practice physical activities, games, sports. So that's like for the big picture. To meet these higher purposes of education, it was argued at the summit, and this has to do with the five action tracks that were mentioned, that we need to connect the dots by looking specifically at our educational systems at the national and the local level, and to transform three of their essential elements. First, schools. Education does not happen in a vacuum. If we want to solve the crisis of equity we face in education, we must transform schools into safe, healthy, inclusive, and stimulating learning places. The schools of the future, whether formal or informal, physical or virtual, must not exclude anybody. They should accept every person and make them feel welcome, cared for, protected, stimulated, and supported in their learning needs and according to their capacities. The school must become the space and time of human integration, of our coming together in our rich human diversity without discrimination of any kind, mockery, abuse, aggression. Second, we have the teachers. To transform education, we must support teachers so that they can also transform themselves into agents of change. Teachers must become knowledge producers, facilitators, guides in the comprehension of complex realities. They must be trained and empowered to transcend from passive to active, from traditional, vertical, unidirectional teacher to collaborative teachers. They must promote learning based on experience, inquiry, and curiosity. They must develop the capacity, the joy, and the discipline for problem solving in their students. And they should also guide their students in learning to care for each other, to confront and to solve conflicts peacefully, and to enjoy each other in their diversity. Of course, today in many of our countries, teachers are poorly trained, undervalued, and underpaid. And they are also held back by outdated roles, methods, tools of instruction. All this must change so that the teaching profession becomes more attractive for younger generations. Teachers deserve decent working conditions, continuous professional development, enhanced status, and of course, wages comparable with professions requiring similar levels of qualifications. Rights, of course, also imply responsibilities, making the monitoring and evaluation of education essential to ensure effective learning outcomes and efficient use of educational investment. So we have schools, we have the teachers, and third, we have the digital revolution. If harnessed properly, this digital revolution could be one of the most powerful tools for ensuring quality education for all and for transforming the way in which teachers teach and learners learn. But if not harnessed properly, as we have seen in many of our countries during the pandemic, it could rather exacerbate inequalities and divide us into increasingly intolerant bubbles. First, this has to do with connectivity. We need universal access to broadband connectivity for teachers, students, and schools. Second, it has to do with capacity so that teachers and other educational personnel can really use this technology effectively in a creative way. And finally, and this is key, it has to do with content, with digital and teaching and learning resources. The problem here is that digital resources are typical public goods. While they require a significant effort and a high fixed cost to be produced, once they are produced, they can be widely used by an increasing amount of teachers and students everywhere with very little or no additional cost. If left to the market, such resources would become artificially scarce and quite expensive. That is why in the summit we argued that we must effectively transform digital teaching and learning resources into global public goods so that their financing, design, production, and distribution is organized so as to guarantee free and open access of teachers and learners all over the world, allowing digital learning resources to effectively foster the sharing of human knowledge from an intercultural perspective. In fact, the initiative Gateways to Public Digital Learning, launched by UNESCO, UNICEF, and other partners during the summit, addresses precisely this need to create and strengthen inclusive digital learning platforms and content. Finally, as it is obvious, all this requires significant investments. The fact is that today we are not investing enough in education. Uh, Educational investment in the world is not only insufficient, but it's terribly unequal. Almost two-thirds of global investment in education, 63%, occur in high-income countries, which account for 10% of world's children. At the same time, lower middle-income countries account for 8% of global investment in education, but must service 50%, half of the world's children. And if you look at the low-income countries, they are trying to educate 25% of the world's children with only 0.6 of global investment in education. This translates into the spending in education was over $8,000 a year in high-income countries. It was about 1,000 in upper middle-income countries, only 3,000 in lower middle-income countries, and merely $50 per year in low-income countries. That is $1 per week per school-age person. You don't have to be an expert in education to understand what this means. These inequalities also occur within countries where resources invested in education don't reach those who need them the most: distant rural areas, marginal urban neighborhoods, indigenous communities, girls, displaced children, and other vulnerable sectors. In the low and lower middle income countries, the challenge of educational investment is so large that it can only be solved if the national efforts are substantially complemented by international financing and cooperation. In most countries, however, educational investment must be financed mainly through national resources, through the national budget. Resources for education cannot be seen as a mere consumption expenditure, but a crucial long-term investment. Investing in education, of course, is a moral and a political imperative, but it should also be understood as an economic imperative. The cost of not financing education is much higher than the cost of financing it. This is something that finance ministers should understand well. They not always do. Most countries, and this is something we argued very strongly at the summit, most countries need to protect and increase the portion of GDP and public expenditure they devote to education, but that is not enough. They must increase the real investment per person. This will require a progressive revamping of existing tax systems, increasing the proportion of taxes to GDP, protecting the level of educational investment, and as outlined in our common agenda, a new global deal is needed to tackle the debt crisis and to allow developing countries to invest more in people, avoiding race to the bottom strategies, perverse tax incentives that we very often use to attract investment against other countries. And then in the end, basically we exempt from taxes the more dynamic sectors of our economies. Of course, it's not just about investing more. We must also invest more equitably in education, both in geographical terms as well as along social economic lines, making sure that families living in poverty in rural areas, as well as those groups and sectors usually discriminated against in their access to these opportunities, such as women, girls, ethnic minorities, persons with disabilities, children living in crisis, will have access to the opportunities offered by high-quality public education. And finally, we must invest more efficiently in education. We have to make sure those increased resources effectively result both in wider access and especially in better learning outcomes. All this is easily said. We've said it many times before. To make it come true, it will take vision, long-term vision over short-term restrictions or profits, but especially it will require the emergence of a strong and youth-led movement to transform education. Without such movement, without such pressure, I think it is unlikely that education will receive the attention, the priority, and the resources it requires in order to fulfill both its deeper and also its functional role for human society at the global and at the local level. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leonardo Garnier, for this excellent presentation where you touch on the essential roles of schools and of teachers. Thank you for making that case and for the opportunities for the digital transformation, but certainly also putting on your glasses when it comes to looking at how the economy has to change when it comes to investing in education. And this is the case for basic to secondary education. This is also true for higher education. And likewise, it is true for lifelong learning. So we need for a whole system approach to education, and we need for a whole society transformation for every stakeholder around the education system to understand the value of education. You make that case very strongly. You also actually embody or translated this very famous saying by Nelson Mandela that if you believe that education is expensive, try ignorance. And indeed, if we do not bring on board all the people that you mentioned in your presentation, we will not be able to transform the world. And it is wonderful that you could put on your glasses as an economist to show that it is so very important to convince governments. But you said so. It has been said many times. What will it take to make these outcomes of the tests or of the World Higher Education Conference or of all the other global endeavors to actually really put the emphasis on this need for the governments to actually care for their education systems? What do you believe will make them actually do that because that is the very difficult point. And since we're here in the SOTG, in the SOTG Sustainability on the Go conference, do you also, that's the second part of my question, and then I give you the floor, and I know we're running out of time, but still it is important. What do you believe, or do you believe with us that the internationalization dynamics that will allow to bring the different stakeholders from around the world together to understand what is happening in the north, in the east, in the south, in the west, to understand how others do it, and hopefully then trigger the kind of innovation and the kind of engagement that is needed, so that there is a global understanding of what would make for quality education and higher education in particular. The floor is back to you.
Thank you. Starting from the end, yes, I think, and as I mentioned, with the global and digital resources, we have an opportunity to learn from each other, to have cross-fertilization between countries, between cultures, and that's a wonderful opportunity. The problem is the first question you ask, how we've said this in the 50s, in the 60s, and the 70s. We keep saying it. And I think we have two very difficult problems. And again, as you say, putting my economist glasses, the problem as I see it is this. When you have a country or countries that are highly unequal and that have a very large supply of cheap labor and a large supply of natural resources, the kind of investment that you attract is not sophisticated investment. It's not highly productive investment. It's very simple investment, extractive investment, whose profitability depends not on increasing productivity and requiring more and more educated workers, but on producing massive commodities with very low costs. So for that kind of economy, education appears as a waste. So the relation between the kind of economy you have and the kind of education you have is very important. But also, and again, this is something that has been said many times, but Acemoglu and Robinson have stated it very more recently. When you have this kind of extractive economies, usually your institutional and your political system is very weak and skewed towards the higher echelons of income and wealth, which again goes against taxing higher incomes to finance public common goods. And this is especially true about education. So one thing is that countries have to escape this poverty trap, because it's a vicious circle. You have low wages, then you have low productivity, little education, and then you keep going on that way. And as I was saying, you use devaluation, lower taxes to attract foreign investment, you deregulate your environment and so forth. So this has to change. And which brings me to the other part. That will only change if people, families, young people move around this and rally around this transformation. When we say that education is a human right and we assume that therefore it should be for everybody, I think we're missing a very important point. No human right was ever graciously conceded. They all had to be fought for. It's not going to be different with education. We have to fight for education. Poor families, rural families, women, we will have to fight for their education. And one of the things, and with this I end, that was very nice about the summit was the presence of a lot of young leaders from very different countries, from very different backgrounds. I think they are the ones that will really force us to make this transformation, because we have to escape poverty traps. Education is critical for that, but the poverty traps are the ones that will not allow us to invest in education. So yeah, it's about politics.
It's about politics, and that's a very, very difficult point. I'm not sure that during this conference we will be able to address all these points, but we have to also try and escape from this 4E trap, the trap of employability, skills education, the trap of excellence without defining it, excellent for the very few without inclusiveness. That's another big trap.
Yep.
The trap of efficiency that comes from the world of economy, actually. So you have to look at what a dollar will result in and what the return on investments are. Very, very well explained in your presentation. But then look at efficacy when it comes to education, where you need time to really broaden the horizons, look at creativity, open up minds, build the capacity and provide for the time for doubt, for rethinking, for involving. So that's another big trap, the efficiency one, where we abide to rules and regulations that don't fit the education systems at large. And then entrepreneurship. Maybe a good thing, but something that also has to be looked at with a different lens and in a different context. I know we're running totally out of time here, and we will have the rest of the conference and the organizers say, but where are you going? But I think you touched on very essential points where we have to look at how we can do this better. When it comes to internationalization, maybe one message that we can also take from your presentation is that internationalization should be done on equal terms from all the different perspectives and the different stakeholders, meaning that it should not be content provided on the digital platforms from only one part of the world, but from the many different parts of the world, which again requires heavy investment in time, energy, intelligence, because otherwise it will not be provided. We cannot leave that to platforms that are commercial and don't understand the gist and the ideas of education. And another very important point is youth. And I hope that one day we will be able to say it's not they will help us change. I think one day we hope we will be all us, the youth and us all changing the education system for the better, because the education ones of better quality will allow to go to this better society that we wish, one that will be much more sustainable than the one in which we live today. So let's take all your points. Let's give that to the speakers that are following, and let's hope they will have an opportunity to really reflect on it and come with additional comments and questions that maybe we can send to you afterwards. Thank you so very much for your time and excellent presentation, and looking forward to exchanging further at any point in time in the future.
Thank you. Pleasure.